Now let's get going with our interesting fascia business today. I would like to introduce Jaap van der Wal, who will be giving the keynote presentation. He is from the University of Maastricht, recently returned there, and he did his PhD there. And his lecture today is a very special lecture because I asked him to speak about his PhD work, which is quite a while ago. And it is very unusual that you ask someone specifically to come back and speak about the PhD work. The reason for that is I think that he has done very, very good anatomical work, renewed the interest in how to look at not only the muscles that are there, but also the other tissues. And actually I think they were one of the first who introduced 3D reconstructions even without the computer programs being there. They made their own. So I think we're in for a good talk, and I'd like to invite him to give his presentation now. Well, there's one thing that I should remark. We will not have questions after the session. The reason for that he's a little bit handicapped. He has trouble hearing, but he's very willing to answer your questions afterwards during the day. So if you have questions for him, please find them, and he will be quite willing to talk to you. Okay, please.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Listening yesterday to all those talks about biochemical issues and cytoskeletons and all those integrating and intriguing details of connective tissue, I start to wonder, what am I doing here? You know, I'm the gross anatomist, and it seems that those people here do not care much about anatomy anymore because they think they know it. Well, then I have to warn you, fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to talk about the anatomy of fascia in a modern way, and maybe you'll hear things you've never heard of. But there was hope. It was Professor Huijing who stated in a discussion paper, which is in your Congress book, that this conference is to make people aware of the difficulties of communication when using the word fascia. And there's a lot to do on that. The title of my talk is The Architecture of Connective Tissue in the Musculoskeletal System. And the subtitle is about proprioception, the connective tissue skeleton as proprioceptive substrate, an often overlooked functional parameter as to proprioception in the locomotor apparatus. That's where it's all about. And my research of so many years ago, 20 years ago, was a trans-border approach. I crossed borders of domains between physiology and anatomy, and I was looking for the organization of proprioception. And I came out that there was no organization of proprioception because proprioception cannot be organized. Proprioception is a functional parameter, and what does it have to do with anatomy? But this time I will tell about that research of 20 years ago in the context of fascial anatomy. So what I'd like to do is to go back to, let's say, zero. It's about gross anatomy. It's about the overlook view. And everything you always wanted to know about fascia and anatomy in detail is in your Congress book. I now would like you to listen to an overlook, to an overview about that question. What is the anatomy of fascia? The best practice still is a good theory. And I think that many of you know, or think they know, the anatomy of the fascia, but maybe we should ask questions about what is the quality of your anatomical knowledge as to fascia. I want to go back to zero. I want to go back to the basics. I'm a dinosaur. You know, you're looking at extincting species. There are hardly any gross anatomists anymore. I'm a medical doctor and I studied anatomy for more than 40 years, but there are hardly any colleagues anymore. Nowadays everybody is fascinated by the molecules, by the DNA, by the cytology, whatever, and I'm still working on that first domain of gross anatomy. But maybe the dinosaur has to talk or has to call something from the past, maybe to warn you about, well, go back to that concepts. Are they the right concepts or did we make mistakes? And that's where it's all about. We made mistakes in studying anatomy. So I will not tell very much about my primary research, which was about proprioception in joint regions. But that was in the framework of a new view on the architecture of connective tissue in the musculoskeletal system, which we practiced in Maastricht University. And that is framed in another, let's say, concept about that functional organization of connective tissue in the human body at all. And that brings me to the anatomy of fascia. I will this time go the other way around. I will start talking with you about the anatomy of fascia, and then we go deeper into the functional consequences. I will go the inductive way, from the big concept, the large concept, back to the details, and at the end I will tell you something about that proprioception and that proprioceptive quality of the connective tissue. First, a methodological introduction. What's in a name? What is in a name, ladies and gentlemen, is very important. It's very important how you call your structures. Let's take this notice of fascia. Fascia can envelop. Of course they can envelop. But they can intervene. They can glide. They can connect. They can bind. We suggest, said Peter Huijing, that the term fascia should not be used by itself, since it's not clear whether this term refers to an anatomical entity or a type of tissue. Fascia, fascia cruris. Is it a fascia or is it an aponeurosis? I mean, and also the question about deep and superficial. Is deep, does it always mean dense? And does superficial always mean loose? There's more to go, and you have to take care of what names you're giving. Think about the gill arches and the pharyngeal arches we had in the human embryo. That were names given to structures, and names are never free as to their value. They are indicating what's in the mind of the anatomist. Maybe let's go back and make the terms free from the dust of the past. Because the past of anatomy is this, we destructed the body. We analyzed the body in structures. But nowadays there comes up another anatomy, which is a functional anatomy. And how do the two relate? Let me go to some examples. Locomotor system. What is a locomotor system? So many of you think that a locomotor system consists of the holy trinity of joints, muscles and bones. But that's not the locomotor system. You have to include everything that has to do with nervous system. And not all the nervous system, maybe the input part and the output part. Locomotor system maybe have a strict sense or road sense. And what about the musculoskeletal system? Do you realize that in that name, the most important part is missing? Between the musculo and the skeletal, there's connective tissue. And it's a very intricate and a very complex organization and anatomy. And simply in the name of musculoskeletal system is because we think that muscles move the skeleton, which is not. The skeleton is not moved by muscles. It's different. The skeleton is moved, if you want to have a cause, by the nervous system, and it's mediated by that, or the muscles are mediating for the motion. And if you lack in your definition already, connective tissue, what does it mean, a musculoskeletal system? What about, is there maybe a connective tissue skeleton? Can you find that in anatomy? Not in anatomy books, but you can find it in anatomy. Ligaments. I still wonder that so many osteopaths call those peritoneal folds still ligaments. That are not ligaments. If you use the term ligament, and you use it for as well the ligament of Treitz, and as well for the ligament cruciatum anterior, you're wrong. How can you use the same name for two such different structures, for two such different architectures? So it's very important to be aware what other names are given. And last but not least, what is a fascia? Fascia or aponeurosis. Let's take that example. You all know the fascia cruris. But what a fascia? Look at this picture in which the fascia cruris has been removed because it was an envelope. And you can remove envelopes. But if you remove the fascia cruris and you make this drawing, then you are wrong. Because you can only remove a fascia cruris when you make a sharp cut between the muscle vesicles inserting to it. It's an aponeurosis. It's not a fascia in the classical way. As an architectural anatomist, I'm not interested only in where. Anatomists are always interested in the where. But I'm also interested in the how. How is the fascia, how is the connective tissue layer organized? How is it organized in between? Is it intervening? Does it make a disconnection? Does it make a connection? Is it investing? How is the architecture, how is the structure of that fascia? Not only where, but also how. And another thing is very important, to connect or not connect. That's the question. Is the fascia a connecting thing, or is it a disconnecting thing, making shape, making possible that things are moving and gliding along each other? So there's more to say than where. Please realize that the anatomist destructed more in your mind than you are aware of. The anatomist dissected, and he found joints and ligaments and bones and muscles. And they are represented in our anatomy books, but they are images. They are not factual structures. It's made, anatomy is made by whom? By the mind of the anatomist. What you want to see, that's what you dissect, and not the other way around. And that's maybe what we have to overcome. Maybe this anatomist tries to heal with the analytic faults and mistakes we made in the past. If you really want to have the connective tissue as an organ of form, like Mrs. Rolfe was stating that, then you should not use a knife. You should not use an analytic mind. How can you describe with an analytic mind something, let's say, architectural and integrative as a connective tissue skeleton? I'm sorry for Tom. I never seen a plantar fascia, but I can make a plantar fascia. I know the way how to dissect a plantar fascia, but I will show you that the plantar fascia is not a fascia, it's an aponeuroses. But it depends on your mind. What you have in your mind, that's what you dissect. So we need maybe a complementary view. The continuity was original, and the continuity has gone under the knife, not only under the knife. Maybe dissection of a scientific method might have nearly gone, I'm a dinosaur. But the dissecting mentality has not. Everybody thinks nowadays in structures, in anatomy. Maybe we have to change our mind. And one person that helps me was Blechschmidt. Blechschmidt was one of the first to describe really on the histological level that there are different, let's say, polarities in the tissue organization of our body. We all are so used to the triad ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. But he proposed not to call about 3 layers, but to talk about 2 principles: limiting tissues and inner tissues. And the limiting tissues are always the part of the body that is limiting the body against the environment or against itself. And inner tissue is then the inside tissue. And don't call that a mesoderm, because an inner tissue cannot be a derm. There are 2 derms in the body, ecto and endo, and in between there's a meso, there's an inner tissue. He was the first one, in embryology at least, to talk about the matrix tissue. Inner tissue could therefore be described as an indifferentiated connective tissue. But if you look at the embryo and you see what happens in connective tissue, what happens in the inner tissue, you might see 2 tendencies. And one tendency you might paraphrase as connecting, and the other is disconnecting, shaping space, centering, or peripherizing. Let me give you some examples. The connective tissue may exhibit 2 functional principles. It might cause connection, binding, bringing parts of the body together, connect them, like blood vessels and connective tissue strands in the embryo very often do. But it also might shape space. For me, a body cavity is not a passive cavity, it's an organ. It's an activity of the connective tissue to disconnect. So shaping space, disconnecting, is also a functional issue of connective tissue. Take the 2 extreme examples. The typical desmal sutures of the skull, which really is a connecting quality. But on the other side, for me, body cavities, and in particular synovial joints, are also organs, are also qualities of the connective tissue, but this time it's a shaping space, it's a disconnecting quality. And on that all, superimposed on that all, there is that original matrix tissue, that original, continuity, enveloping connective tissue skeleton, which is everywhere and nowhere, but has the 2 qualities of connect and disconnect. And please, in my view, don't call synovial joints just hinges. They are not hinges. That they can be replaced by a hinge by an orthopedic surgeon does not prove it are hinges. It are not passive junctions between the bones, it are active organs of disconnection, and it's one of the functions of connective tissue to disconnect and to enable mobility. That was philosophical. Let's go more into anatomy. Let's go into the facts. Indeed, what's in the name? Fascia of aponeurosis. Your fascia cruris can also be described as a very important aponeurosis. In an aponeurosis, you have linearly transmitting forces piece of connective tissue. And it's not only enveloping or intervening, it's an important area. But on the other hand, you will see that the fascia cruris also serves as an envelope. And you know that about the compartment syndrome. When the muscles swell, it might be very dangerous because they are in that strong fascial or envelope compartment. But on the other side, the compartment wall is, for the function of the muscles in there, very important as aponeurotic stricture. And look what we do in anatomical books. We always clean the muscles. Cleaning the muscles. It was the first thing I learned when I was an anatomist, to clean the muscles. But how do you clean muscles? Remove the connective tissue. Sometimes that's very easy, but very often it means that you make the muscle as naked as possible and make him functionally lame because you remove its tendon, its aponeurosis. So those pictures, look at those pictures. Impossible pictures. Impossible pictures. And it's written in every anatomy book that your forearm muscles are inserting to the skeleton. I've never seen any vesicle of a forearm muscle inserting to a skeleton. You know what's lacking here? Here is exactly lacking what I'm looking for, and that's the connective tissue skeleton. It's not described. It has been dissected away. And in the mind of the anatomist, it is as if it does not exist. Look what happens if I cut into an antebrachial fascia. When I cut into an antebrachial fascia, I start to wonder immediately, is it a fascia, an envelope covering or ensheathing, or is it an aponeurosis with muscle fibers inserting to it? It's so simple. If you dissect on the distal side of a forearm and you take away the antebrachial fascia, you will indeed see an envelope. An envelope that makes it possible that the structures can glide and can move and can roll around each other. There, the distal antebrachial fascia serves as a sliding organ or a sliding connection. It makes possible the mobility of the muscles. But here something quite different happens. Here you have to make a sharp cut to cut the muscle vesicles away from the antebrachial fascia, and there you deal with another mediation, and that's the mediation of tractile forces. Forces have to be mediated there, and that's something else for the fascia to do as it is here. And still, we deal with the same anatomical structure, an antebrachial fascia, but what a different architecture. So that I will give an example of. It was the work we did 20 years ago to go into that elbow joint region and to dissect not the structures of anatomy, but try to dissect qualities. What we did was not going for joints and ligaments and muscles, but we tried to do a kind of tissue-sparing dissection in order to separate the two consistencies of tissues. For example, separate connective tissue and muscular tissue, but not dissecting structures. And this happened. It's just an example. What we found there is applicable to the whole human body, but here I could show it you very clearly how this works. Every time you look in those pictures at a left arm, you will see a left arm, and here you have the lateral epicondyle, and this is the proximal antebrachial region. If we open that, I told you, in the distal region, there's no problem. There are muscles, there's gliding, loose, no, not loose, areolar tissue in it. Don't call it loose, as Peter proposed, because it also connects, but this time it makes disconnection possible. It shapes the possibility of gliding and movement. But here something else has to happen. Here you have to remove sharply the muscle vesicles from the regular dense connective tissue the antebrachial fascia here is. We called that in those days an alternative dissection. Maybe it's better to call it a complementary dissection in order to find let's say the anatomy that disappears when you start to dissect structures. And this is how it looks in the proximal region. You see that every muscle vesicle of that so-called third extensor, third finger extensor, is connected with connective tissue, intermuscular septa, antebrachial fascia, with another intermuscular septa. So that's how it works. And if you want to take out that muscle, you have to do that by releasing all those muscle vesicles from the so-called enveloping fascia. It's not an enveloping fascia, it's an epiderotic connective tissue structure. Also those so-called intermuscular septa, which here enable motion, here are for force transmitting, clearly or apparently force transmitting qualities. Intermuscular septa, regular dense connective tissue. And we went on. So every muscle in this way had to be removed from its compartment walls. It came out that there in the proximal region of the antebrachial region, in the proximal part, there was an enormous complex connective tissue apparatus. You have to imagine cases or compartments, and they all converge to that lateral epicondyle. No muscle vesicle, not any of them, not any muscle vesicle of the extensor antebrachial muscles were inserting to the epicondyle. And every anatomy book states that and writes that and shows that, and it's not. The muscle vesicles are inserting to this enormous, intricate and complex connective tissue apparatus, and it's this connective tissue apparatus that is connected with the periost of the lateral epicondyle. So there was a first notion that all those muscle vesicles are not inserted directly to the skeleton, but indirectly over a connective tissue system, which is not an exception, but was never noticed before here in this area. Here you see it. Here you see that there are muscle compartment walls and there are intermuscular septa. I will talk about the supinator muscle very soon, and that all converge to that epicondyle. It is regular dense connective tissue skeleton around the humeroradial joint. And it's converging to the lateral epicondyle, and it's an intricate part of the extensor muscles that are inserting via that. What does that mean for our notion about how the forces are transmitted in this region? The lateral epicondyle has layers of connective tissue converging to it, and in series there are the muscles. And that exactly is not indicated here. Here it is suggested that you have muscles crossing the joints, and of course everybody knows that in there are ligaments crossing the joints, and we did not find those ligaments. What we found was this. We found that complex connective tissue, and we met what every student on my dissection room is meeting, because if we approach the elbow joint, there always comes the question, the despaired question of the student, I cannot find the ligaments. And then I answer, well, you have to make them. And they start to make them. Because you cannot find the ligaments that are described in the anatomy book, like the collateral radial and the collateral ulnar ligament. They are not there. Why are they not there? They are made. It goes like this. This is how a modern anatomy book, now conquering all Europe, is telling that the extensor muscles are inserting to the lateral epicondyle. Look what it tells about the supinator muscle. This is the supinator muscle, and it should also originate from the lateral epicondyle. Look what we found. We found that in the classical anatomy, the view still is that you have ligaments crossing the joint, connecting the two bones, as a passive force-transmitting system, and that parallel to that, you have the muscles with their connective tissue apparatus or their tendons, and they're talking about an in parallel situation. And we all say, well, that's obvious because this will transmit the forces passively or statically, and this will transmit the forces in a more dynamical way. And that's how ligaments are thought. But if you look at this in this way, you see that ligaments are quite an inefficient structure, because ligaments can only guide the forces in a very particular position of the joint. And I cannot suspect that evolution has been that inefficient. It is not like this. We did not find those so-called collateral ligaments. What we found was that these ligaments are parts of that complex connective tissue apparatus we discovered between the muscles and in series with the muscle vesicles. This is what the artist made of it. And he could only do this because the anatomist showed him this. This was in the mind of the anatomist, and by sharp cutting he made those ligaments. And it's the artist's impression that makes a story complete, because the artist's impression always makes smooth what the anatomist has sharply dissected. And we all start to think about collateral, radial and collateral ulnar ligaments. How to make a collateral ligament? First you do it in your mind. First you think they are there, and then by sharp dissection you make them. It's not in this way. It's not that you have muscles parallel to ligaments, and ligaments are, enforcement of the capsule. The capsule is here in blue. It's not in this way. It's in this way. And what is this? This is the in-series organization. This is a typical parallel organization of the muscular component and the ligamentous component. But here you see that the connective tissue and the muscular tissue are one, in series with each other, which is far more efficient. Because this means that in every position of the joint, you can regulate the tension of that connective tissue, and it will help you to keep the joint parts together in every position of the joint. Look at the supinator muscle. Everybody knows the supinator muscle, and everybody knows the annular ligament. We did not find an annular ligament. An annular ligament is an artifact. And how do you make an annular ligament? Here you see the supinator muscle, and he has a strong aponeurosis. And now it came out that this aponeurosis is part of that connective tissue system converging to the epicondyle. It's also a part of that very complex converging system of connective tissue layers. It's not like this, that you have a joint with a capsule and an annular ligament, and that over it or parallel to it there's a supinator muscles. No, it's not like this. It's like this. The so-called annular ligament is a part of the aponeurotic extension in series with the muscle tissue of the supinator muscle. This is not how an annular ligament looks like. This is how it works. It's a functional concept. Something is enveloping the radial head and keeps it in position. But it's not a ligament. It's not an anatomical entity. So do not mix up functional entities, which you can think as a model, with anatomical entities, because the anatomical entity might be different. What happens here is that also the annular ligament was made by sharp dissection. How? You just sharply cut the continuity of that aponeurotic layer, which was part of that very complex lateral connective tissue system in the lateral elbow region. And the nice thing is that you can show this apparatus also on all modern techniques like MRI, and you will always see that it's true, all those so-called ligaments are parts of that complicated system, and that system is the force-transmitting quality of the connective tissue and not the enveloping quality. This is the old situation. In the old situation, connective and muscle tissue are organized in parallel. And ligaments can only be functional in one particular joint position if they are stretched. And then they will signal, then they will give proprioceptive, what we call proprioceptive information. But in the new concept, you have a different situation. In the new concept, you see that in every joint position, the connective tissue can be put under stress and can play its force-transmitting and joint-stabilizing role. Ligaments are functional in this way in every joint position. And actually, it are not ligaments anymore. This is what I try to show you, that just because this is not only applicable to the elbow region, you can find it everywhere, that the classical view that connective tissue is a passive or static force transmission component, and that the muscles are the dynamic force transmitting components, that you can fuse that and bring that together in one dynamic system to control the movements of your joints, but also to keep the integrity of the joint together. This is what we found in our anatomical dissection in the proximal elbow region. That in the proximal area you have a transmuscular organization. There are intermuscular septa, all those cases, all those compartment walls, and yes, in the distal region, there you have the muscle. So you have to think from muscle to a transmuscular organization. And if you ask for force transmission, you'll see that in the distal region, it fits with anatomy. But here you have to think transanatomical, you have to think transmuscular, and think in other entities, in architectural entities. The functional entity is not always the muscle. Maybe the muscle is not a functional entity. I was looking for architectural units, because in our opinion in Maastricht, you have two forces to guide through a locomotor system. And that are the compressing forces, you know, the bones compressing upon each other. And the other is the transmission of tensile forces. And for the transmission of tensile forces, you have muscle and connective tissue as a possibility. But what we did until now was thinking that connective tissue was the passive or static way to do it, and the muscular tissue was the dynamic way. But in the view we are thinking, we might have to integrate in our mind muscles and ligaments not as separate, but as one. And that you have indeed not muscle or ligament as the entity of force transmission, but that the entity of force transmissions are maybe something like a dynamite. Our view is that not muscles or connective tissue, ligaments are connecting the bones, but that you have to think architecturally, I do not say anatomically, architecturally, in the kind of dynamite. And a dynamite is the connection between two skeletal elements with two layers of connective tissue, and in between there's indeed a dynamic component, the muscular tissue. A dynamite. And with this dynamite structure, you can make all the elements of the locomotor system. You don't need two entities, you can do it with all one. And it goes like this. If you think on the dynamite as the architectural unit, you can do this. You can make all kinds of muscles, you can make all kinds of dynamites, you can make all kinds of ligaments. Let's try. Here you see the distal organization, which is so wrongly depicted in the anatomical books, because here you need an enormous connective tissue to be pointed out. So let's do it in this way. Now I organize the dynamite in a situation that I have a proximal intermuscular septum and a distal muscular tendon. And in between, there's the dynamic muscular tissue. And a very beautiful example, of course, is the supinator muscle. You have very many supinator muscles. Supinator muscles are muscles that are directly connected to the periost of the bone, and on the other side you have an aponeurotic structure which often is described as a ligament but functions as a dynamite. But of course there are muscles that do not have connective tissues or septal walls or tendons to intermediate with the skeletal tissue. Then you have the fleshy muscle like a deltoid muscle. But it gives you another opportunity to make a whole range of directions into your muscular organization. And look at the triceps muscle, which is the reverse of a supinator muscle. In distally, it has an aponeurotic component, and proximally, it's inserted directly to the bone. And then the actual ligament. This is a ligament. A ligament is a dynamite without a muscular tissue. And that's why a dynamite is an exception. A ligament is a very exceptional structure. You hardly find them. If you take a Maastricht anatomist and you let him dissect the body, you will hardly find any ligament. Because a ligament is a very exceptional structure. Why? If you want to create a connection between two skeletal elements with only connective tissue or dense fibrous connective tissue, it has to be very exceptional. Why? A ligament can only be there if in every joint position the distance between the insertions of the ligament is at the same distance, because collagenous connective tissue is a very resisting tissue that does not give any relaxation or any flexibility. So at every position of the joint, the two inserting areas of the ligament has to be in the same distance, and that is very exceptional. There are some exceptions, but the rule is actually the dynamite organization. So that's how we see a ligament, as a kind of specialized dynamite. And we are helped by the physiologists, because the physiologists discovered another locomotion system. They discovered another musculoskeletal system. Let's go to the brain. Why the brain? Because the brain is part, the nervous system is part of the locomotion system. And maybe the brain is not thinking in muscles and ligaments. Maybe the brain is thinking in architectural units. Let's try to find out if it helps to think in concepts of movement. The usual concept, for example, is that joints and muscles are giving information. Information about position, information about the forces that are guided. And the usual concept is based on the classic view that you have joints, and that you have joints with ligaments, with capsules and muscles, and that the muscles move the joints. So you have two forces or sources, two sources of proprioceptive information. You have the so-called joint receptors and you have the so-called muscle receptors. And in those early days, everybody was convinced that the muscle receptors were for the muscle motor control, for the reflex acts. And that the joint receptors, yes, that were actually the mechanoreceptor substrate for information about joint position. But in the model we are now proposing, this might fuse or this might mix up. And in the classical view, joint receptors are in the capsules and ligaments. And you just saw an anatomist not finding ligaments or hardly find them. So what does he have to do with that proprioceptive substrate if joint receptors are maybe not joint receptors? And the other were the muscle receptors. They were in the muscles, muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs. That was the classical view, and it's very often practiced in all kinds of anatomy books. What I think is this. The brain knows nothing about the muscles. Of course, the brain knows nothing about the muscles. Because you do not live in muscle activity, you do not supinate, you screw, you turn screws into a wall. You do not abduct your fingers, you spread your fingers. And don't think that there are muscles to spread your fingers. Even your interossei muscles cannot do that. Because if you give your interossei muscle an impulse, your fingers will not spread, they will also flex. Spreading your fingers, screwing, into a wall is not the same as supination or abduction. It's something else. And the brain knows nothing about muscles, it knows about motions. It knows about actions. It knows about tasks. And that's what you learn. You do not learn in muscles. You have to get rid of it. I always tell my students that muscles do not have functions. Muscles have effects. They have mechanisms. And if they contract or release, they have a certain mechanical effect. But functions is what the locomotor system, including the brain, is achieving with the muscles. And then you come to screwing and walking and stabilizing. And in humans it's even worse, because upon, on the higher level of functions and tasks, you have the function of actions. And as a therapist, you should know. You should know that persons can be hindered in their functions, but they can still perform a good action. Ask your patients with pain in the shoulder to abduct their arms, and very often they will stop because they have pain. And then ask them to take the file from the casket, to take a dossier or a file, and then they will suddenly raise their arm, because that's an action, and that's something else as a function or a task. The brain doesn't know about muscles. There are no muscles in our so-called motor man. There is no motor man on your cortex. It's not representing the anatomy, it's representing the functions, and that's something else. And architecture might be the missing link between that functional organization and that anatomical organization. Maybe only on the level of the ventral horn there is something in the cerebral system or the nervous system that might represent muscles. But far beyond that, you don't deal with muscles anymore. Now I come to my last issue. And that was the research we did so many years ago. I have 5 minutes left for that, but I will do my best. It's about proprioception. And we all know that proprioception is dependent on mechanoreceptors. What I tell you now is important. Proprioception is not dependent on proprioceptors. There are no proprioceptors. Proprioception is an action, is a function. And it is performed on the basis of information. And the information comes from the mechanoreceptors. And now comes the questions, where are the mechanoreceptors organized? Where are they situated? In muscles, ligaments, joints? Or are they organized in connective tissue architecture? And that's the last thing I have to tell you in less than 4 minutes. The sense organs are okay. You have Golgi-like organs, spindle-like organs, and that can more react on tensile forces, and you have mechanoreceptors that are more equipped to react on compressive forces. And of course you have the muscle spindle. But that the muscle spindle is an adjustable receptor equipped with muscle fascicles doesn't mean it's a muscle receptor. It's not a muscle receptor. It's a mechanoreceptor, and a very specialized one, but it does not mean it is typical for muscle. I will show you that the muscle spindles also are related to connective tissue and not to muscle organization. Here you are. This is the area that we studied. This was the area we studied in the rat. And the same thing that we did in the human being was first describing the anatomy of the elbow region as an architectural organization. And also in the rat, we found those transmuscular units. For example, we found such an epicondylar muscle connective tissue apparatus with muscle connective tissue layers converging to the epicondyle and muscle fascicles inserting to it, and no muscle fascicle itself reaching the epicondyle. So studying in this way and then looking for the mechanoreceptive substrate was very surprising. Where can you find the mechanoreceptors in this transmuscular, this, let's say, connective tissue muscle in series organizations? Well, in the substrate itself, in the septa, there's hardly any mechanoreceptor substrate. Why not? It's not functional. It's collagenous connective tissue and it can only, tear apart. So why put there a mechanoreceptor? A nociceptor is enough and it will tell you about limits, but there's hardly any mechanoreceptor substrate in it. Where is the mechanoreceptor substrate? At the transitions of the muscular tissue to those septa. There you have, oh my God, Golgi tendon organs. But Golgi tendon organs are muscle receptors, aren't they? Yes, but yet there are Golgi tendon organs inserting to all those proximal, so-called ligamentous layers, Golgi tendon organs. But Golgi tendon organs should not be there because Golgi tendon organs are usually receptors linked with muscles and tendons. So in some of the muscles we found a lot of those so-called proximal Golgi tendon organs, and we could not classify them. Are they Ruffini-like, it is a joint receptor, or are they Golgi tendon-like, which is a muscle receptor? And it all fits in our theory that this is the proximal connective tissue apparatus has, to do with the joint, but it's not a joint ligament. And here you see those receptors, and even the muscle spindles seems to be oriented in the transmission line of force, the line of transmission of forces. Here, for example, you see the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle, and there you see that all the muscle spindles, all the proximal, all the distal GTOs are organized in between the skeleton of the proximal and the distal connective tissue. And that was the main rule. Even the type of nerve fascicles that were inserting those proximal connective tissue layers, they simply resembled the innervation of a ligament. The so-called antebrachial fascia, the so-called supinator or annular ligament or supinator septum or aponeurosis was completely innervated by a plexus of nerve fascicles that indeed had all kind of nerve fibers that also were connected with mechanoreceptive substrate and of course with nociceptive substrate. This is the classical situation we found. I see my chairman coming up. To summarize that is that actually the organization of the substrate, organization of the mechanoreceptive substrate was more according to the architectural muscular connective tissue architecture we found there than in the classical bifurcation of ligaments versus muscles. And that was the main conclusion we could draw. I will go very fast. Even the muscle spindles were not organized according to the muscle. They were organized according to the connective tissue. So if you ask, what is proprioception? How is it organized? Don't look for the classical anatomy of muscles, ligaments, and joints. That's not how it's organized. It's organized in the architecture. Which architecture? The architecture of the connective tissue. And that's a good way to do because the architecture of the connective tissue represents the skeleton of the locomotion system. Let's say amen. And let's say conclude that for me it's the conclusion, it's clear. At the end you can say that you can combine those so-called muscle receptors and joint receptors. There are no muscle receptors and joint receptors. You have three types of receptors, mechanoreceptors, and they are organized architecturally. So I can conclude that at the end, physiological parameters is the context that determines whether a certain mechanoreceptor is activated or not. It's not activated by a muscle or by a ligament. The context of that mechanoreceptor is architectural. That means that the architecture of the locomotion system is instrumental in the process of proprioception and not the anatomical organization. I hope you enjoyed a little bit about my talk.